Look, it's a real pleasure to be with you. As it happens, I sound very English, but I was born in Cardiff and to a Welsh father and a Scottish mother. And one of the reasons that I've got involved in head injury over all these years is because of one of my relatives who lived in Aviemore for many, many years, Alison Gracie, who had two brain injuries. The first was a stroke, and the second was a major fall down a flight of stairs. And I remember feeling so poignantly how, I mean, it's a terrible phrase that nobody would use anymore today, but she used to sort of hit herself on the head and say, MD, MD. So you could feel that there was a person in there who some parts of her brain were working and her humanity was still there, but she felt trapped because her brain and her body wouldn't do what she wanted it to do. And so for the last, I've been an MP since 2001. You get fewer years for murder. But for the last 10 years, pretty much, I've been involved in putting together an all-party parliamentary group on acquired brain injury. Now, what's an all-party parliamentary group? It is what it says on the tin, basically, which is that it brings together MPs and members of the House of Lords from all different political parties. It has to be different political parties. So Conservatives, Labour, SNP, Liberals, everything, to talk about and to push forward a debate on any particular issue. And ours is acquired brain injury. It actually started because I was worried about what was happening in my own constituency in South Wales with former rugby players, because so many spoke of having had many, many concussions during their rugby playing era. And now they're suffering from fatigue. And I don't just mean tiredness. I mean that real debilitating fatigue, which means that and it's nothing to do with willpower. It's that complete sense of not being able to do anything. Depression, major anxiety, sudden mood swings, all the symptoms that, and indeed suicide as well, all the symptoms that we now associate it with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and the sustained damage to the brain done by concussion. And when I first started raising these things with the Welsh Rugby Union, they just weren't interested. Were very complacent, very blasé about it. There weren't many rules about being taken off the pitch if you'd had a brain injury. And the instinctive thing for most rugby players was to want to carry on, you know, to show how strong and macho you are and all the rest of it. And then there was the terrible story of the young lad in Northern Ireland, Ben Robinson, who had had a concussion, went back on, kept on playing, and had a second concussion, which led to his death. And double impact syndrome, this is often referred to, especially amongst youngsters. And that made a group of us in the House of Commons, myself, Tanny Gray-Thompson, Chris Heaton-Harris, John Glenn, various others, to want to put together a parliamentary group that would look at all the issues relating to brain injury. And we were very fortunate to have the support of Willie Stewart, who quite famously, I think, has done a lot of work on brain injury in sport in Scotland, and helped change the Scottish RFU's position on brain injury and on concussion quite early on. I worked closely too with Dawn Astle, whose father was diagnosed, whose father was a famous football player, played for West Bromwich Albion. He was famous for heading the ball, and he, when he died, the coroner, some 14 years ago now, said that he had died of an industrial injury from heading the ball. And yet still, the Football Association's rules are weak compared to rugby, which is much better now. FIFA refuses to guarantee that you'd have at least 10 minutes to be able to assess whether somebody's had a brain injury, and you can't have a replacement on the pitch whilst the test is going on. This is clearly a nonsense, and I think means that football still hasn't taken concussion and brain injury seriously. We've looked at a whole series of different issues, though, in the group. I was very struck that I know the statistics for Wales and for England better than for Scotland, but the creation of the major trauma units, which sometimes was very upsetting because it meant that you're closing smaller units and concentrating them in much bigger ones, but further afield for many people, has meant that we've been able to save many, many more lives of people who've had brain injuries, for instance, traumatic brain injuries through road traffic accidents. The best part of 750 extra lives saved every year in England alone. But the problem is that all too often we've saved people's lives, but we've not given them a quality of life, because a quarter of all the major trauma units don't have any consultant in neurorehabilitation. Quite often there's not enough neurorehabilitation available for people to be able to have a consistent and prolonged support. And quite often, once people have gone from the acute hospital to other hospitalized care and then on into the community, the support simply isn't there. And we've been arguing for a long time now that, first of all, just as you have a prescription, which you have in your hand, that you can take to the chemist, so you should have a prescription for your neurorehabilitation. Because in the end, this isn't the best argument in favor of this, but this is an argument that works with some people. In the end, if you imagine somebody who's had a major brain injury, they may be relying on 4, 5, 6 people in the week to wash them, clothe them, feed them, clean them, and all the rest. If you can enable them to have a more independent life, especially when many of these people are youngsters who've been in road traffic accidents, so you may be talking about 50, 60, 70 years of life, and then across that life, if they've gone from needing 6 people to needing 1 or 2, or God willing, perhaps even not needing any support at all, then you'll have saved a vast amount of money to the taxpayer. But even more importantly, of course, if we can guarantee that quality of life to people, we should. I mean, it's just a moral imperative, it seems to me. And there are other issues that we've taken up. We've taken up the issue in relation to our armed forces, because a lot of our armed forces personnel have not been diagnosed with a brain injury before they enter the armed forces, or when they've sustained, for instance, a bomb attack. Quite often they've been diagnosed with PTSD rather than with a brain injury. And that's because there's very little screening for brain injury done by the British armed forces, unlike the Americans, for instance. Likewise, there's a major issue in education. I represent one of the poorest constituencies in the country, but it's a shocking statistic that children of poorer families are 4 times more likely to have a serious brain injury by the age of 5 than children from wealthier families. That's the same for children in their teenage years. Both obviously very important times for the development of the brain inside the head. And all too often what happens is, when the brain injuries happen, either the parents, for all sorts of different reasons, are too nervous or anxious about taking the child to hospital, so it remains undiagnosed, or sometimes it is diagnosed and everybody thinks after a few weeks, oh, the child, everybody's very good at school and for the first few weeks after the brain injury, but then a few weeks later everybody says, oh, she or he seems to have got better. And then 9 months later, when that child starts suffering from fatigue, has difficulty with executive functions, fails to turn up on time, lacks an ability to inhibit themselves, they get into trouble, and school doesn't recognize that it's actually the brain injury that hasn't been dealt with that is the problem. So then the child gets excluded. Then the child, again, nobody notices that this is all to do with the brain injury. So the child ends up in the criminal justice system, and then they end up in prison. And extraordinarily, the work that we've done, that has been done by the Disabilities Trust over the last couple of years, shows that more than 60% of new prisoners arriving in prison have had a significant brain injury at least once, and in many cases 3, 4, or 5 times before they come to prison. So failing to deal with brain injury in kids not only can damage their educational opportunities, but can be a major long-term problem in the criminal justice system as well. There's one other area where we've done a lot of work on the committee, and that is in relation to the Department for Work and Pensions, because I've heard horrific stories. I've met people who've had horrible, horrible brain injuries. They know, one woman said to me, she said, I know I'm meant to use all the energy I've got to get my brain better. And that's what I try to do all day, every day. But when it comes to applying for the financial support from government through the Department of Work and Pensions that I need, to be able to eat and pay the bills, that takes up every single drop of energy I've got. So I'm using my energy not to get better, but just to make applications to the Department for Work and Pensions. And all too often, of course, the people who administer the system and the people who assess people don't really understand brain injury well enough. So they don't understand that the condition can vary. They don't understand how to deal with fatigue, because they sometimes, in their heads, it looks too much like laziness, and they don't understand the inability to inhibit and the problems that people might have with executive functions like turning up on time and things like that. So one of the things that we've been very keen in the committee to say, in the all-party group to say, is that every single person who assesses people for whatever kind of sickness-related benefits in the Department of Work and Pensions must be trained in brain injury as well. I'll just say 2 other things, and then I'm very happy to take questions. The first is that, as you'll have noticed, I'm talking about nearly every department in government that's affected by all of this. Obviously, health, whether you're in England, Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland, whichever health minister it is or department, there's clearly an implication here. Education, I've already referred to, again, whether it's devolved or not. There are obviously implications for local government, for housing, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Ministry of Defence. Quite often there are implications for the Foreign Office as well, because of the way that people are treated by the consular service when they may have suffered a brain injury abroad. And of course for the Treasury, in terms of how much money is allocated in the whole of this field. And that's why I've been very, very keen to make sure that government treats this not as a series of different silos, but as one whole, as one, because in the end it's a hidden epidemic in the UK. Maybe 1.4 million people directly affected by it, let alone the family members and others who've been affected by brain injury over the years. That requires a whole government approach. So one of the things that I've been pushing Michael Gove, because he's the Minister for the Cabinet Office, to look at is setting up a cross-departmental ministerial task force to look at all the implications of this. And to try and bring all the different strands together so that the Department for Justice isn't clashing with the Home Office, isn't clashing with education, isn't clashing with the health service, and so on. I also that's the only way, I think, that we can manage to make sure that the whole of government takes this equally seriously. And my anxiety is that the Ministry of Justice, for instance, I think we will probably manage to persuade them to screen all prisoners arriving in prison. Incidentally, one thing I didn't mention, the figures I gave earlier about prisoners arriving and having had brain injuries before they enter the criminal justice system apply to men, but the figures for women are even more worrying, because 67% of women arriving in the criminal justice system, this is in English prisons anyway, and I don't doubt that it's the same in Scotland, have had brain injuries, and 65% of those brain injuries were from domestic violence. In other words, one of the problems that we have is that the victims of the domestic violence end up getting into the criminal justice system because their brain injury isn't properly treated. So the victims become double victims of the system, in a sense. So I'm hopeful that Michael Gove says he's going to set up this ministerial group. He said it would be up and running by July. I'm going to see him next week, and I'm very hopeful that we'll get that sorted. I'm also hopeful. I had a right old row with Victoria Prentice, who's the Minister for Prisons, about the problems we've got there, and I think we are likely to get changes in the law that's going through Parliament at the moment to make sure that all prisoners do get screened when they arrive on the prison estate. And this takes me to the final point I'd make, which is, well, what's a brain injury? Well, obviously, it's an injury to the brain. An acquired brain injury is one that can be acquired in many different ways. It might be from concussion, it might be from a road traffic accident, it could perfectly well be from hypoxia, it could be from some form of poisoning, it could be related to fetal alcohol syndrome, it could be related to carbon monoxide poisoning, and some of the evidence now shows that it's not just a massive big burst of carbon monoxide poisoning that can do the damage. It could be a sustained lower level as well. So that has obvious implications for the law as well on people's housing. It could be stroke. And now it seems very clearly it could also be coronavirus. Now, there's quite significant evidence to show that, whereas we originally thought that coronavirus was primarily a disease of the lungs, in many ways it's a disease of the whole body, and often may have its most profound effects on the brain. And so I think, in a sense, whereas the government might have been tempted to say, well, all we can do is look after COVID, I actually think that this is an opportunity for us to say to government very, very clearly, whether in the devolved government or in central government, look, for a start, you can't just run the NHS solely to deal with coronavirus. You've got to be looking at cancer and brain injury and all the other aspects, because so many people have found themselves rather shunted to the side during this epidemic, where when they've been making requests for neurorehabilitation. But also, you've got to integrate coronavirus with the other strategies that you have for dealing with other conditions. And this brain injury is one of the key areas where it's possible to do that. So I'm hopeful that we would, that very soon we will see a significant change in attitude in government, in central government anyway, towards tackling these issues. And I guess the final point I'd make is that I've met so many amazing people I've been involved in this issue around brain injury for the best part of 10 years now. And I've met so many amazing people. One young, well, he was 8 when I first met him. He must be 12 now, lad, who came down to Parliament from Scotland to lobby his MP. and his MP now, is always asking me what's happening with brain injury, what's happening with brain injury, what's happening with brain injury. Family members who've managed to help their loved one go from needing massive support to being far more independent. People who've been able to talk openly about, the change in their personality, and finding ways of learning to deal with the changes that have happened inside their brain. And I've also met some extraordinary doctors, scientists, physicians, surgeons, nurses, care workers who've done a phenomenal job. And let's not leave out the lawyers, because I know sometimes people want to be rude about lawyers, but actually there are many, many people in the UK who would never have had the kind of support that they've been able to have if it hadn't been for a lawyer pursuing a claim on their behalf and fighting their corner. So I want to say an enormous thank you to all of you for all of that, both family members, people who've been living with brain injury, doctors, lawyers, care workers, and all the charities who've done so much work. Now, I've spoken for 18 minutes, which is, I think, longer than I was meant to, and that's what normally happens with MPs. But I'm very happy to answer questions. Anne-Marie, do you want me to sort of look at the questions and
No, I've got some for you, Chris. Since you're just such a busy man, so I'll do that for you. So my first question is from Deborah. Are there any developments for people with dual diagnosis, e.g. pre-existing substance abuse or mental health problems who then get a traumatic brain injury?
Well, you're probably asking about Scotland, and the truth is I'm not expert on the provision in Scotland, but you make a very good point, Deborah, which is that it's actually relatively rare for brain injury to come alone as a condition, as it were. Quite often there are other, if you've been in a road traffic accident, you may have all sorts of other problems as well. And I think one of the complexities about what we deal with is, if we'd made the advances in understanding how the mind sits inside the brain that we've made in relation to cancer, say, or lots of other conditions, or polio or whatever, then we would be in a much better place than we are today. One of my anxieties is that a lot of clinical trials have been stopped recently because of COVID, and we need to get them back up and running. And we need to get the funding base for the charities who work in this field back up and running as well. I'm afraid that's not a great answer, Deborah, because I don't know the specific situation in Scotland, but your point is well made that mental health and brain health, as it were, need to sit together, don't they?
Thank you so much, Chris. My next question's from Jacqueline. Are you beginning to see departments like DWP taking notice of your committee recommendations?
Yes, it varies. This is the truth. I mean, the thing is, whenever I stand up in parliamentary questions now, whatever department it is, they all go, he's going to raise brain injury. And they all go, oh, where's the brain injury briefing note? Every time there's a new minister, and unfortunately this happens rather frequently, I go and visit them and I explain to them, and some of them are really good and really understand it. And unfortunately, nearly always they get sacked about 3 weeks afterwards. But I'm told by ministers that everybody now who is an assessor for any sickness-related benefit at DWP is trained in brain injury. Whether that's true, I don't know, but that's what I'm told and guaranteed by government ministers. So I hope it's moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much for that one, Chris. My next one is from Kimberly. Just wondering what Chris proposes will happen with the prisoners who are found to have a brain injury if scans are introduced.
Right, so I should explain the difference between screening and scanning. Scanning obviously means, you know, you're put through an MRI scanner or something similar. There are also more complicated scanners that you might want to use. That's obviously quite a tall order for every prisoner coming into prison. What we're talking about is screening, which is much simpler. It's 3 simple questions, which have been proved to be enormously helpful. So where I've seen this most in action is in Cardiff Prison. They had a terrible problem with noise and misbehaviour in the prison. When they started doing the screening of prisoners, they worked out that one of the things that somebody who's had a brain injury might find difficult is timeliness, turning up on time, and loud noise. As it happens, some parts of Cardiff Prison are quieter than others. So simply moving the prisoners who've had brain injuries, as detected through the screening process, to the quieter end of the prison has dramatically changed the atmosphere in the whole place. And making sure that they get reminders 5 minutes before they've got to do something has made a dramatic difference in their timeliness, which means that they don't get into so much trouble for not turning up on time because somebody thinks that they're sort of, you know, breaking the rules. So there are simple things that you can do just by knowing that somebody's had a brain injury. And one of the most moving things I saw was when a man who's been in and out of prison several times in his life and finds turning up on time finds it difficult to control his emotions, and doesn't understand why he can't. When it was explained to him that the brain injury he sustained at the age of 7 and the massive concussion when he was 15 are probably a very substantial part of why this happens, he said it felt like a weight being taken off his shoulders, not because it meant that he's not responsible somehow for his behavior. He still is responsible for his behavior, but it just meant that people could start giving him strategies for how to deal with that, because he knew it was about something in his brain. So that's the kind of thing. Thanks, Kimberly. Good question.
This one's not so much a question. Just Rebecca would like to say a big thank you to you for all you're doing and all your great work. And then I'll move in for another question. Glenn has said, thanks, Chris, regarding your wish for DWP assessors to have brain injury training. Where are we with that officially? My experience in 2019 and 2020 is that they are ignorant about a brain injury.
Well, as I say, in theory, I'm told by government ministers that they are all trained, and the different companies that have got the contracts tell me that they are. However, Glenn, if you've had problems, I think it's really important that you write to your MP to tell them about that, because that is something that MPs can keep on raising with government ministers. And yeah, I think the more we can raise awareness, the better. And my experience is if you write to your own MP, that really does start to make a difference. And tell them to join the all-party parliamentary group.
That's great, thanks. Now, I think with timing, I'll move on to one final question, Chris. So this is from Judith. Thanks for your insightful presentation. Rehab after brain injury really just feels like the poor relation in stroke care. How can I, as an individual, help to take the case for better rehab to politicians and Parliament and ensure it improves?
So I would say that neurorehabilitation care around the country varies enormously. I can't speak, I don't know, obviously don't know the situation in Scotland so well as I know it in Wales. Local to me, we have a very, very good service, and that was partly including in relation to stroke. And that was partly because we had 2 consultants who very early on in like the 80s and early 90s did amazing work. I think there is pressure on finances, which doesn't help. And we need to make sure that every trauma unit has a proper neurorehabilitation consultant. The best way to take this argument to anybody is to go to your elected MP or member of the Scottish Parliament. I don't know whether there's a similar group in the Scottish Parliament, actually. If there isn't, there should be. I would have thought there would be. But writing to your MP, because obviously some of these issues are devolved, but some of them are Westminster responsibilities still. I think that makes a dramatic difference. The more MPs get through their letterbox, whether it's virtual or real, as it were, the better. And you can always, if you write to your MP, do persuade them to sign up to the all-party parliamentary group on brain injury.
Chris, thank you so much for that. I'm sorry I've ran out of time for more questions, but some more questions have come up, but they are more relevant to Scotland.
Okay.
But I'd like to thank you for your time. It has been very insightful, and please keep up all the hard work. It is much appreciated. So thank you for your time.
What's the picture behind you? Is it a map?
It's a map of the Clyde, yes.
All right. My great uncle lived in Dumbarton Road. He was a naval architect, and he used to maintain that he used to water ski into work.
Oh. Well,
whether that is true,
with the weather we're having,
I have no idea.
So thank you so much,
Okay.
Chris. It has been much appreciated giving up your time today, and please keep up all the good work with your cross-parliamentary group. Thank you.
Lovely.
Bye.
Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Bye.